I love reclassing in Fire Emblem. It does have its issues like messing with unit identity, but it's also really useful for making repeat playthroughs more entertaining. It's been a few years since Engage was released, and we don't yet have a firm date for Fortune's Weave, so I've been making a lot of use of this mechanic, just so I can continue investing time into my hyperfixation of choice. So when I started my most recent playthrough of Engage, I decided that I would do an all reclassing run, where every unit in my army, except for one which I'll explain later, had to be reclassed with a second seal into a different class. I love to play around with reclassing in Fire Emblem anyways, so another restriction I added was that I wouldn't be reclassing any units into classes that I had already used and therefore knew what to expect, and that every unit had to end in a different class. This was really fun for me and I really enjoyed the unit building side of it, so what I wanted to do was rank all of the unit builds I made based on how much fun I had with them, and how much I would recommend trying them out in your own playthroughs. Full disclosure, I played this run on normal classic because that's how I like to play Engage, and I wasn't necessarily reclassing with harder difficulties in mind, so some of these builds might be completely useless for the way that you like to play Fire Emblem. As a result, my decisions are being made primarily based on how much fun they were and how much I liked them compared to the original class. So, if you're waiting for Fortune's Weave but you still have a Fire Emblem itch that you want to scratch, give some of these builds a try. Now let's get into the rankings. So, the first unit I want to talk about I actually didn't reclass. This was Seedle, who I kept as a dancer for one specific reason. I'm actually really bad at using dancers. The only dancers that I have consistently used as dancers, not reclassing them, have been the dancers from FE4, Laura from FE5 and Azura from Fates, and for each of these there are additional factors encouraging me to use them, and even then I sometimes still treat the more modern dancers like Azura and Olivia as combat units. I was always the person that would load out my Pokemon's movesets with physical moves until I was about 20, and I'm still learning that lesson with Fire Emblem support units. So for a run where I was challenging myself to use new builds and characters, I wanted to challenge myself to actually try and use Seedle as intended because I don't normally do that. He did still sometimes end up in combat, but I think he averaged out as having one battle for every map he played, so I'll take that as a win. Starting off with Seedle's combat, I knew he wouldn't be hitting hard and I didn't want to encourage myself to try and make him a serious threat. I just wanted him to be able to dodge incoming attacks and maybe hit back with a bit of force if needed. So I gave him the flashing fist art with the Micaiah engraving. This just meant that he was really hard to hit. I did forge this to increase its power, but honestly I just had some resources left at the end of the run that I could spend. It absolutely isn't worth it if you don't have much metal or gold. I also gave him Draconic Hex for those odd occasions where he was initiating combat, so that he could get in, do a bit of damage, avoid being hit himself and lower his opponent's stats. This gave him a bit more diversity and I could see it working on other builds, but as I said, he wasn't really initiating, so there was limited effectiveness. For the rest of Seedle's build, I focused on upping his supportive capabilities. I gave him Tiki as an emblem so he could give other units revival stones, and quality time from Corrin so that he could heal allies after supporting them. For the rest of the loadout, I gave him a shielding art that he never used, and some healing items that he also never used. Honestly, I just like my units to have a full inventory so I don't lose track of chest items and enemy drops. Overall, I think I did better with this version of Seedle than what I normally do with dancers, which is treat them like combat units or ignore them entirely. But let's actually get into the units I did reclass. Number 13. Halberdier Alfred. I'm honestly not the biggest fan of Alfred. When I started playing Engage, the fandom seemed to think he was a top tier unit, but I never seemed to get the same unit that was being praised on the internet. The only time I've ever been able to make him work is when I saw that you could reclass him into Thief. I put him into Halberdier to see how he would do as a backup unit, and he actually had the highest strength stat in the army, but he did a terrible job showing it. I gave Alfred the Edelgard emblem, because it tends to be pretty good in my experience, but honestly it wasn't anything exciting. Ideally I would have given him Ike or Hector, but they were busy. Maybe Roy would have been a better choice, I don't know. For skills, I gave Alfred dual assist for obvious reasons and also quick riposte from Hector because he wasn't really very fast. This is probably the best thing I did for him since it helped him to double when counterattacking, which he really needed help with. Alfred's main weapon was the Represai Lance, which I forged and gave a Crom engraving. This was pretty good and synergised well with quick riposte, as did the spear. His other main weapon was a silver great lance with the Hector engraving, and he didn't use this a lot but it did hit really hard. Overall, this one was just a bit disappointing. It took a while to get online, and once it did it was pretty mediocre. I don't recommend it. Number 12. Wyvern Lord Bunay. I've never used Bunay before, mainly just because I don't find him appealing to begin with, and then I also heard from the fandom all about how he was one of, if not the worst unit in the game. But he was also the only character from Engage that I had never used, so I wanted to give him a go. I put him in Wyvern because I had a slightly clearer idea for my other units and I thought it would give him a better shot, but I don't know if that was the right choice honestly. He was a very bulky unit, decent strength, good HP and defense, which I buffed with the Ike Ring, but he was also really slow, he couldn't crit consistently, and his strength stat didn't really seem to pay off in combat. His main weapon was the Noaton, which was really cheap to forge. I also gave it a Sorin engraving, which boosts damage output and helped him to kill. I also gave him a killing edge with an Aaliyah engraving to see if he could kill through crits and wrath, but his low dexterity meant that it was pretty inconsistent. Probably the best thing I did was give him the Canter and break defenses skills. Canter is just a really good skill for movement boosts, and break defenses took advantage of his weapon triangle control, to give him a chance to do extra damage or crit when he broke his opponents. Overall, he wasn't awful, but I think the only reason for that was because I was playing on normal mode. In harder difficulties, this build would be atrocious. I don't think I chose the right build for him, it didn't really help, so maybe next time I use Binir, I'll do something different. Number 11. Martial Master Hortensia. Hortensia is widely accepted as one of the best units in Engage due to the personal ability, unique class she gets, and power as a healer. I didn't want to lose this completely when I brought her into my army, but I did want to see how her healing prowess is affected by a class change. I went with Martial Master because I wanted to remove her access to tomes and see how she did with arts, and also because she has an equal strength and magic growth, which fits well with the weapon type of arts. As it turns out, she really needs magic tomes if you wanted to defend herself. She actually had the third worst strength stat in the army, though her magic stat was pretty good. The only thing I didn't do much that could have helped her was chain guarding, just because I often forget about this ability. Hortensia's main role was going to be healing still, so I gave her Micaiah and a variety of staves that changed each battle to let her support the army with healing, movement and so on. For a weapon, I actually got the Divine Fist art, but I really wouldn't recommend doing this, I just had a lot of spare cash at the end of my run. A silver art would work just fine, and I put a Leif engraving on this to boost hit and avoid. Hortensia's skills were pretty simple. I gave her magic +3 to boost her healing and damage output, and a staff mastery to boost her healing potential and offensive staffing. She wasn't the worst unit by any means, but when you look at her original class, there's just no way to really justify putting her into this class instead. Just keep her in a wing tamer, that's what she wants. Number 10. General Boucheron. Oh, Boucheron. Honestly, not the best unit. He has a really high build and HP growth, but that's somewhat mitigated by the fact that he doesn't take hits very well. He has a small personal strength growth, and that his huge HP stat means that chain attacks actually do quite a lot of damage. He does actually have a decent defense growth, so I wanted to try to lean into this by classing him into General. I've put Boucheron's summary in the screen here, but I should point out that his rating is only 156 here because he's being weighted down by a heavy smash weapon. Boucheron's build stat is 25, meaning that he isn't weighed down at all by any of his other weapons, and for that reason I did want to point out that his rating should actually be 170. Putting Boucheron into General did actually give me the result I wanted. He still had high HP and build, but he also had one of the highest strength stats in the army, and his defense was obviously huge. The main problem I found was the same problem you get with any general. They just can't really keep up, and that's a pretty significant problem, meaning they often get left behind and you then don't end up getting a return on your investment. I gave Boucheron a pair of boots to boost this up to 5, which did help him, but boots are a very precious resource that are arguably better used on other builds. Looking at the rest of the build, I gave Boucheron the Hector emblem so that he could double when counterattacking with quick riposte. I feel like this skill was made for armoured units and worked really well with Boucheron's Tomahawk because he would barely get scratched from most enemies, and then he would immediately hit back twice and kill them. I also gave him the Ukon Varsera with an Ike engraving for heavy hits on player phase and a Brave Axe for when doubling was necessary. His skill selections of Canter and Axe Power 3 were also pretty simple because he had very simple objectives to meet. Tank hits, hit back hard, and don't fall behind. Overall, he wasn't the best unit, which is why I have him down at the bottom, but I would actually recommend giving this build a try if you like him. It did patch some of the issues that I normally have with Boucheron, but it is a lot of investment for a unit that ultimately struggles to keep up. If you don't like him, then honestly there are probably better generals out there. Number 9. Paladin Chloe. Out of all the units I reclassed, this was probably one of my biggest disappointments. Chloe is my favourite character in Engage, and as a result of that she's seen a lot of reclasses already. Chloe actually has a higher magic growth than strength growth, so she works really well in magic and mixed attacking classes like Sage, Mage Knight and High Priest, as well as healing classes like her suggested promotion of Griffin Knight or as a Royal Knight. Having exhausted all of these options as well as Wolf Knight, I decided to put Chloe into the Paladin class to preserve her high mobility and a high lance rank. Unfortunately this ended up being really disappointing. I wasn't adding in extra second seals into the game, so by the time I reclassed Chloe I was used to getting her usual amazing performance, and got something that was honestly just worse in return. She wasn't hitting very hard, she didn't have healing capabilities, and she wasn't taking hits well. She wasn't doubling at first either, so I gave her speed plus with Lyn, and by the time she got Sigurd back and didn't need the counter skill anymore, her base speed was pretty high, so I gave her Alacrity, which really helped her to kill enemies and avoid being damaged. As mentioned, Chloe got the Sigurd ring because I think this was the right choice for her. Chloe also got lots of battles, and this is in part because she was able to dominate the map and rush into attack first. I gave her my second pair of boots so that she would have 8 movement. As for the weapons, she had a couple of different lances like a silver lance and the fencerlier, but once she got the Bryanak, that was pretty much all she used. She had pretty much come online at that point too, so it worked really well. I buffed it a bit more with a forge and a byleth engraving for a little bit of extra crit and avoid, and I also gave her a flame lance, which is usually really good on Chloe, but because of the paladin's class growth, her magic stat didn't really develop, so it only really came in handy if her opponents had high defense. What's kinda weird is that on paper, Chloe was probably one of the better units in my army. She had some of the most battles and wins even after I tried to control for join time. She also had the second highest build and speed stats. I think the reason for this big discrepancy is honestly just that I didn't have fun with this Chloe. She's normally a really consistent unit, but this build actually took a bit of time to get online, and by the time she was there, I had already given up on enjoying her. She wasn't a bad unit by any means, just underwhelming. I would really recommend just putting her into one of her base promotions, or reclassing her into a magic class for a better experience. Number 8, Griffin Knight Rosado. So from this point onwards, I would really recommend any of these builds for you to try out. Classing Rosado into Griffin Knight felt like a bit of a cheat since it's the other option for Pegasus Knights, but Rosado starts as a Wyvern Lord and can't go into Pegasus, so I'm gonna let it slide. Rosado is up there with Chloe as one of my favourite Fire Emblem units, and he does have a reputation of being not very good. What I normally do is put him into Halberdier, and that often turns out a good result, but I thought that Griffin Knight would also be a good option as he's never going to be the strongest unit, so he can at least contribute through healing this way. I also really needed another healer at that point in the game, and his performance was pretty middling, but I do think it was a pretty good build. The main thing I did wrong with Rosado was giving him Camilla. It wasn't a terrible choice at all, but it didn't massively play into his strengths other than giving him extra speed. He also didn't have a high enough magic stat to deal damage with any of her weapons other than Camilla's axe, though I would argue that that weapon is just pretty good anyways. I could see that Rosado wasn't very bulky, so I gave him the Axe Guard 4 skill, which I misread as you taking less damage when using an axe. And it turns out that Axe Guard applies when your opponent is using an axe. I mean, what's more embarrassing is that I didn't even realise this mistake during gameplay. Someone on the Emblems video pointed out in the comments after I posted it. Thanks, by the way. Bringing it back to skills that I actually understand, I also gave Rosado Speed Taker since I noticed he was sometimes struggling to double. As for equipment, Rosado made use of pretty much everything in his inventory. His main weapon was the Revanche, forged and with a Camilla engrave, but if you don't have the DLC then a killer axe with a Corin engrave does the exact same job. It just allowed him to consistently crit. He also made use of the Tomahawk and a Brave Axe as well when he couldn't rely on a crit chance, and I also gave him Mend and Physic for healing. I might be a bit biased, but I honestly think it turned out pretty good. Rosado isn't the best unit, but he was able to contribute in this role. The only thing I would maybe change is giving him an emblem that would maybe boost his avoid more, like Moth, or one to buff his supportive capabilities like Byleth. Number 7. High Priest Citrine. It's actually quite hard to reclass a magic user into anything other than a magic user. Case in point, Hortensia. When I was planning out builds in my head, I had noticed I was only really going to have 2 magic users, so I wanted Citrine to stay in a magical class, so High Priest was the only other option. What I got was a unit that was very min-maxed. Citrine had the highest magic stat by a wide margin, the highest resistance, and also the 3rd highest luck, but for literally every other skill she was at the bottom of the ladder, with the worst strength, dex, defense and build, the 2nd worst HP, and the 3rd worst speed stat. That being said, that didn't really slow her down. Well, the low speed stat did, but it didn't stop her from killing things. Her bulk was problematic if she was out on the front lines, but that just didn't really happen. She also tended to kill whatever she hit. Her win to battle ratio was the 2nd highest out of everyone's, so she didn't really have to worry about counterattacks. Citrine originally had Celica as an emblem, but since Celica wasn't available for 10 chapters in the mid-game, she ended up using Veronica instead. This worked pretty well since Veronica's engage weapons are fairly strong, and the Fortify Plus staff is amazing, but Celica would also be pretty great here, and would probably even save you some time as Citrine definitely wants to be accessing Celica's skill tree. I had a little bit of time available to grind Citrine's bond with Celica without having to resort to skirmishes, so I was able to give her magic +5, but honestly any additional magic is good for her. I also gave her holdout ++ because of her frailty, But this pretty much never got used because by the time I'd gotten this skill, I'd also just learned to keep her away from hordes of physical attackers. It was kind of self-regulating. Also, like I mentioned before, she wasn't really leaving anything with enough HP to counterattack in the first place. This is in large part due to her main weapon, which was a forged Bolganon with a Veronica engraving that helped to boost her damage and supplement avoid and dodge. The engraving also lowers hit and crit, but Citrine was never going to be critting anyways. Going back, I would maybe choose avoid boosting skills from Moth instead of Holdout, as these are more likely to keep her from getting flattened. Citrine also had an Excalibur tome for flyers and a steel handout that she mainly used to break enemy archers and mages. I also gave her a Fortify staff and a Recover staff. Overall, she was just a very simple and very effective unit. She healed her allies and she hit like a magical semi-truck. Not hugely different from her original classes, but I would still recommend that you try this one out. Number 6. Swordmaster Jawn. Jawn is known for having crazy growth rates due to his personal skill which boosts your growth rates in your class. For that reason, I chose to put Jawn into a class that is very specialised in its stat spread towards speed and dexterity. And as it turns out, investing into 2 of the best stats gives you a really good fighting unit. Jawn had the highest speed in the army and the second highest dex. He also had the highest ratio of kills for the battles he was in, meaning that he was killing most of the opponents that he fought within 1 round of combat. This was in massive part due to his 2 main weapons of 11 Sword and a Killing Edge with a Corin engraving. 11 Sword was great for all of the physical units he fought because he had a okay magic stat, and it was really handy for training him up. The Killing Edge coupled with high dexterity and a Corin engrave meant that he crit most of the time that he used it. He was honestly unstoppable once he got going and only really needed those 2 weapons. I gave Jawn the Lin Ring just to boost his speed and dex even further. He was more or less always activating Alacrity due to his high speed, so he's pretty much untouchable. I gave him the usual choices of Star Sphere and Lineage while I was training him up, but after that period he got Strength Dex Plus and Dual Assist so he could help out his teammates and also to make sure he was always critting and killing. The only problems I had with Jawn were firstly his movement, especially during training. He just seemed to always be falling behind, so I gave him the boost to help him out. The other problem is the problem that all training units have, which is that they're really hard to train. It's recommended that you wait until you can reclass Jawn before you train him so his internal level doesn't get too high, but that just meant that he only really started being deployed around chapter 10 or 12. Plus, in an all reclassing run, competition for second seals is even more fierce, so you had to wait a little bit longer for one than you normally would. If you're on a harder difficulty, it would be really hard to get him online. As much as it's an investment though, I do love to see a build come together, so if you enjoy training units, give this build a go. Number 5. Thief Etier. I chose Thief for Etier because I didn't really have any other units that I wanted in that class, but I do always like to have a knife wielding unit in Engage because knives are just cool. As a thief, Etier's stats weren't really exceptional, but I had a lot of fun with her and she was pretty consistent with crits. This was in spite of a dexterity stat that was honestly not very high compared to some of her allies. The fact that she was still critting consistently is probably due to the Lin engrave that she had on her main weapon, which was the Forged Silver Knife, up until she got the Syncadea knife, which then took over. I gave Etier Corin because I really like the covert version of Dragonvein that creates fog on the map to boost Avoid. This meant that Etier very rarely got hit because she was regularly creating terrain that gave her plus 60 Avoid due to covert unit type bonuses. She was also able to freeze and debuff enemies using Draconic Hex and Dreadful Aura. For Etier's skills, I gave her Speed and Dex Plus to catch up to both of those stats, as well as Brute Force from Crom which boosts the power of crits. This skill is usually overkill, but it did help Etier at times to make sure that when she crit she was definitely killing her opponent. This one is kinda strange because when I was looking at all the units' performances, Etier was very consistently in the middle or near the bottom. But like I said, the main factor I'm looking at for these rankings was fun and how I liked these builds compared to the original. And this ultimately was just a really fun build, especially in conjunction with my top choice. Number 4. Bow Knight Aaliyah. I'd originally planned to put Aaliyah into Great Knight because I'd never seemed to really have any units in that class, but then I realised that I only had one bow user in my army, so I put them in Bow Knight instead. This resulted in me having a really solid unit that on a numbers standpoint alone was the best unit in the army. They had the highest stat total, the most kills, even after controlling for availability, and they were also in the top 3 for having the highest HP, strength, dex, speed and luck stats. I gave Aaliyah the Byleth emblem and this was okay, but I only really used it for Goddess Dance, which wasn't even as good as it normally is on Aaliyah because their reclass meant it only boosted dexterity, and not 7 different stats at the same time. Marth or Roy might have been better options honestly. For their skills, Aaliyah got Canter Plus for movement and Keen Insight to boost their damage with flyers. I couldn't think of anything better. For weapons, Aaliyah's main 2 were the Liberation with a Marth engrave, which is really cheap to forge, and also a killer bow with the Erica engrave, which turned Aaliyah into a crit machine. The armor slayer was also very handy in the early stages of the build, and the longbow had obvious uses for long distance. I did put the willy glands? Surely not. Vela glance. Okay, I did put the Vela glance onto their inventory, but honestly it was just outclassed by the other weapons. This was a really powerful build, and if we were going off of just performance then it would be at the number 1 spot, but the other 3 above it were honestly just more fun to play. Number 3, Mage Knight Merrin. I knew that Merrin had an equal magic and strength growth, so when I was looking for another spell user she seemed like a good choice. This did require me to sacrifice Merrin's strength a little bit, since Mage Knight only has a 5% growth for strength, but it still turned out acceptable, especially when paired with a lightweight sword and high speed. Merrin's main sword was the Folkvanger, which I was able to forge high up pretty early in the game. I also put a Lucina grave on it to make it lighter and boost Merrin's avoid and dodge. I tried to make her Excalibur tome her main tome, which is why I forged it, but honestly she just used a mix of all 3. I gave Merrin the Erica ring, and this seemed like the ideal emblem for her. She got a bit of a boost to magic and dexterity, as well as giving her the wind sword when engaged. She also became the designated corrupted killer with Sieglind, which was especially useful for all the corrupted worms in the back end of the game. Her skill selection was also pretty basic, but that's just because momentum and canter both work really well. Who doesn't want 6 extra damage or the chance to reposition yourself after moving? I don't think I was selling this one very well, but there just isn't a lot to say about Merrin other than she was just really good. She had a fun build, I wouldn't change anything, and she had a very well defined role in the army. It's quite fitting that she's in 3rd place actually, because when I was ranking all of my units, whenever Merrin made the podium it was in 3rd place. 3rd highest magic, 3rd highest resistance, 3rd highest stat rating. She was just really consistent. I really recommend that you try this one out. Number 2, Royal Knight Fram. I really like Fram. She is almost always on my army because she pulls so much weight in the early game through healing and guarding, but I do often find myself getting bored of her always being some variant of Martial Monk. I thought about how I could include her in this run, and I chose Royal Knight so that she could still have healer contributions while being able to attack, and if all else failed, she would still be able to be a healer. This turned out to be one of the most fun reclasses I've done. Fram wasn't often demolishing her enemies, but when she did, you could bet that she hit hard. I gave her the Fencerlier with Sigurd engraving, and I also forged this up. When I was able to, I also forged her a Flame Lance and put a Tiki engraving on it to boost damage output. This ended up as a winning combo because when the Fencerlier didn't work, the Flame Lance did and vice versa. When Fram wasn't attacking, she also made solid contributions as a healer. I supported this build with the Counter Plus skill, which helped her to move about, and 4 levels of Staff Mastery, which was really helpful for boosting Fram's healing output as she was locked to sea staves. For Fram's emblem, I gave her Crom. I'm not sure what Crom's intended user is supposed to look like, but I always like to give him to units with mixed attacking potential since engaging with him grants you plus 10 magic. This made Fram an absolute beast with her Flame Lance and Robin's Levin Sword. No physical unit could withstand any hits from her. The Brute Force skill rarely came into play since she never really crit, but what was surprisingly helpful was Crom's surprise attack skill, as this let her avoid counterattacks altogether when she was in avoid boosting terrain. This also synergised well with Etier and the Fog Dragon Vein. Fram had cavalry movement, which helped her to actually get through the fog tiles to attack, and then once she got there, she wouldn't be counterattacked because of surprise attack. Fram also ended up with a relatively good physical and magical defense stats, having the 3rd highest res and defense out of everyone. The only thing she was really missing for bulk was a good build and HP stat. This is a build where I'm not sure how well it would translate to harder difficulties, but it was ultimately just a build that was really fun, and it gave a new lease of life to a unit that I was starting to feel bored with. I'd really recommend that if you like Fram, then you give this one a try. Number 1, Sniper Yunaka. This build was so much fun. I decided early on that I wanted Etier and Yunaka to swap classes, and although Etier did come out as a fun unit, Yunaka definitely got the better end of that deal. All Yunaka ever wanted to do in this build was to crit, and oh boy did she crit. When I could get both trained to kill and no distractions to activate at once, Yunaka would get an extra 25 crit. And it turns out this was relatively easy to manufacture. A lot of units didn't have 2 range or 3 range if I was using a longbow, and Etier was literally a fog machine. The amount of synergy these 2 units had was honestly crazy. This, coupled with a dex stat of literally 52, meant that Yunaka very rarely failed to crit, especially with her main weapon of a forged killer bow with an Edelgard engraving. Critting is already fun in Fire Emblem, but it's especially fun when it's almost guaranteed, and also when your crit quotes sound like this.
You're dead. Another kill for me.
When it came to skills with Yunaka, I felt a little bit like I was just adding to something that was already amazing, so I'm honestly not sure how much these skills help. She had a level 20 bond with Lucina, so Dex plus 5 was really easy to get, and I also gave her Alacrity so that if she missed her first crit she got another chance straight away. But honestly, both of these skills felt a bit like putting a hat on a hat. She was just already really good. Maybe Wrath would have been a good idea, but honestly Yunaka wasn't really getting hit often enough to even build up damage. For the rest of Yunaka's loadout, she only really used her longbow and radiant bow. The longbow was good for 3 range and the radiant bow was really good for armoured units, especially when I was still getting the crit build online. Yunaka has a surprisingly high magic growth and I previously used her as a mage knight, so I knew this would be a good fit on her. I also gave her the Lucina ring for dex and speed boosts, as well as dual assist shenanigans with the longbow. Overall, who doesn't love a crit machine? I had the most fun in this playthrough when I was using Yunaka because not only was it a great build, but it also fit well with her unit identity as a former assassin, and she was generally one of the top contributors in the army. Honestly, she really put a lot of my previous archer builds to shame. I would absolutely recommend this build if you haven't tried it already, especially if you have any better ideas for what skills she could inherit. So that's it. 13 reclass builds plus 1 poorly executed dancer that you might want to try in your next Engage playthrough. Doing an all reclass run has honestly been some of the most fun I've had when playing Fire Emblem, and I would genuinely love to hear what builds you guys have done in the game, whether they were amazing, joke units, or just absolutely atrocious. I loved hearing your ideas for DLC emblems after my last 2 uploads, so please give me more of your ideas and share your builds with each other. I am aware in making this that I've used quite a few DLC features in my builds and not everyone has the DLC, but honestly I don't think there's too many things in the builds I made that you wouldn't be able to substitute with something from the base game. If you don't have a Camilla engraving, use a Corrin one. If Veronica isn't available, Celica is right there. The only thing I can't really think of a substitute for is Quick Riposte from Hector, but if you have a general that you want to buff, then Sigurd is also a really good option in a completely different way. Or if you really want to stick to bulk, then you can use Ike. As long as you're having fun with your builds, then there should be no pressure to pay for a DLC that isn't even used by some of the people who have bought it. Base Engage is already great. But that's it for now. I think going forward I'm going to try and have a video out every second Sunday, so if you enjoy videos about theory crafting, unit building and getting more fun out of the same old games, then make sure you hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.